Okay, well, good afternoon all, and welcome back to Good Moves. I'm Ian, I'm your host, and long time no see. Happy New Year to you all, and may our bad luck last as long as our New Year's resolutions. Um, well, just before I begin, I've noticed that I'm appearing a little foggy on my screen. I spoke with a friend about this earlier who suggested to me that it may be a lights issue. Anyway, I've done what I can to remedy this. If I do appear a little foggy on your screen, you'll just have to forgive me for that. And anyway, I hope you'll be paying more attention to the chess than me. So, uh, going to begin our sessions this year by showing a game by the great Tigran Petrosian, Tigran Ivanovich Petrosian in full. And so I read recently that there have been, due to the COVID pandemic, basically games, chess tournaments have had to be cancelled, not entirely because arrangements have been made so that players can still play, albeit in isolation. But due to rumours, suspicions of cheating, so it's been suggested, for instance, that even some of the best players in the world, if you'd credit it, have been using powerful chess engines for tips. And so apparently the great Petrosian was recently, I don't know if he was, he may have even been stripped of his honours, because apparently in one game he was where cameras or a camera had been set up. He was nonetheless observed to frequently turn away from his board to look at who knows what. But it then transpired that there was a strange coincidence between these glances away from the board and him then making perfect moves on the board. And when the chess engines were also consulted afterwards, there was a strange coincidence in that the chess engines just happened to make the same moves as Petrosian did. So that's a bit disappointing, to be sure. I mean, nobody likes a cheat in sport. But having said all this, I don't know for sure, so I'm not in a position to cast any judgment on Petrosian. In any event, Petrosian still remains as one of the all-time greats. And we're going to look at a game of his played in Budapest in 1955. And this was a match between the USSR and Hungary. And Petrosian's opponent in this game is one Benko, who is a great American chess player. And prior to the rise of Bobby Fischer, Benko was a United States chess champion on several occasions. So certainly no slouch. So I'm going to bring up my ball, which is just here. And I will just enlarge myself fractionally on the top of the right, and there we are. Ah, okay, so Petrosian's playing whites in this game, and he plays d4. Benko replies knight f6, and after c4, e6, knight c3, and bishop d4, we have the so-called Nimzo Indian defense pioneered by the late Aaron Nimzovich in the early 20th century. So basically, the idea of this defense is, well, it's Black has quite a few ideas in this system. The main idea behind this pin is that for the moment, White is prevented from setting up this, impressive pawn center with e4. Simply because, that just drops a pawn to knight takes e4. Of course, the knight and c3 can't recapture there because of the pin. So instead, White continues here e3. Other moves are possible. And basically, with this move c5, basically one of Black's, or part of Black's strategy in this defense is because he essentially can't now, he's not entirely forced to trade this bishop for the knight, but were he not to, it's not really in the spirit of the opening. So another part of Black's strategy is actually to trade this bishop, this dark squared bishop, for this knight on c3, thereby doubling White's pawns on the c file. And well, doubled pawns are, of course, not generally something that you want, because they often turn out to be an organic weakness. The problem is, of course, when pawns are doubled, they're unable to defend one another, unlike they can when they're on the adjacent files. So, but basically, one of the potential problems that Black has after this exchange is that it leaves him slightly more vulnerable on the dark squares, obviously, with that dark squared bishop no longer being on the board. So Black aims to remedy that by placing his, or some of his pawns, not all, to be clear, but by placing some of his pawns, particularly around the centre on dark squares. So it makes sense, right? So White now kicks the bishop, and we get the trade that I mentioned, and we also get the doubled pawns. So here they are on the c3 and c4. And knight c6, bishop d3, and now b6. So basically, another thing that Black sometimes aims for in this position is to target these pawns on c4 and c3. I mean, in particular, that c4 pawn can often come under fire from moves like bishop c8 to a6 and knight c6 to a5. And basically, Black aims to tie White down to the defense of that pawn, and at the same time generate activity in other sectors of the board. And one of the greatest exponents, interestingly, of this defense as Black was Bobby Fischer, who I've already mentioned. And if you find any games compilations of his, you'll find some really great examples of how to play this opening as Black, or certainly if you're interested, finding out more about some of the ideas that black typically employs in this system. So now white is free to advance in the centre, e4. And in fact, white is even threatening to advance that pawn 1 square further now to e5, thereby dislodging that knight on f6 and essentially trying to cause some disruption in black's setup. So that explains why Benko plays e5 himself here. And now, of course, if these pawns are traded, well, you know, this isn't really to white's liking. Knight takes e5. White doesn't want to lose the bishop and indeed the bishop pair. Then that bishop will have to drop back to e2, for example. And it's true that that knight can be dislodged by another pawn move to f4. But, you know, this is not really what white is playing for. And in fact, white does better simply to advance in the centre with d5, which Petrosian does. So this forces the knight on c6 to move. So the knight comes over to a5. And, well, you know, the knight, I think it was the great German master Tarrasch who said the knight on the rim is dim. And certainly this isn't an ideal square for the knight, but, you know, it does, for the moment, target the pawn on c4. Certainly if black can successfully round up that pawn, he will have an extra pawn and may be able to consolidate an advantage. Anyway. Petrosian here continues knight f3. It was actually more vigorous here to continue f4. But anyway, it's not the only move, but it's certainly very energetic. But knight f3 is good. And because of there's a threat to the e5 pawn here, well, there are two ways to defend that. You could, of course, bring this pawn up to d6, which is very solid. Benko here plays queen e7. And Petrosian castles. Good choice, sensible. Pursuing development. And also, even though this e-file is closed, also just gets the king off of the, of course, you know, don't generally want your king staring down the same file at one of your opponent's major pieces, such as their queen or one of their rooks. So bishop a6, and so basically this is the strategy that I mentioned earlier in that, so you can see basically black's beginning to add pressure to this c4 pawn. And now, you know, Petrosian has to make a choice here. You know, you can, if you want to hold on to that pawn, yep, you can play queen e2. You can also play queen a4, but the queen is a bit misplaced there. Basically, I mean, Benko could actually just castle queenside here. Maybe even play the king up to b7 just to give some protection to that bishop on a6. This is not really what Petrosian wants. Basically, you can see in that kind of way the queen would end up, you know, not being, just not being very well placed on a4. So Petrosian finds a much more promising continuation in knight h4. And now problem is here is knight f5 is, you know, a very strong threat here, because of course that would, you know, so if, for example, bishop takes c4, you're going to get knight f5, and basically the queen's under attack, the g7 pawn's threatened, so you probably have to play queen f8 here. Um, yeah, and then I mean, I'm just wondering. I don't know for sure. I mean, I'm just wondering if it's even possible to play, d6 in this position. Um, well, I mean, without further analysis, it would be difficult to evaluate the merits, potential merits of that move. Although you can see, I mean, this is, leaving black in a, bit of a bind. But anyway, so rather than allowing knight h4, Benko play, or knight f5, I should say. Benko plays this pawn up to g. Whoops, I need to take that back. I beg your pardon. So instead of taking the pawn, Benko here plays g6. So basically, that pawn on c4 isn't going anywhere. And at least now g6 means that you can't play knight f5 because obviously the knight will be lost. So now f4. And this comes with more force that basically when white has castled kingside, because of course one of the things we want to do, of course, is to increase the scope of our rooks. If we're to open lines, generate more activity, potentially get at our opponent's king. So, of course, with this move f4, this basically achieves those things. And now, I mean, ordinarily, well, if you wanted to maintain the pawn on e5, you'd have to play a move like d6. But the problem is this is not good because of this pawn exchange. And the problem is here that you've got no time to recapture with the pawn actually because of bishop g5, and basically black's losing a piece there because of this pin against this knight on f6. The knight can't move without the loss of the black queen, and it's not possible to bring another piece to defend that knight on f6. So, and if instead queen takes e5, well then that runs into queen f3. And again, basically, black is in trouble here because that knight again is under threat. And if the knight moves, then the pawn on f7 will drop with check. Of course, the queen will be supported by the rook on f1. So therefore, there's no time to support that pawn. So Benko basically makes a run for it with his king, which we can understand. But this turns out not to be too good either. And so now it was possible for Petrosian to exchange on e5 still. And then after queen takes e5, just bring the knight back to f3. And basically, even though, yep, it's true that that pawn on c3 will drop. For example, queen takes c3, that can just simply be met by bishop g5. And again, basically, black has some problems here. Anyway. So, but instead here, Petrosian just plays knight f3, increasing the pressure on the e5 pawn. Benko replies d6, and now we get a trade of pawns here. Now, of course, you can't, Benko can't recapture the pawn on e5 with his queen there, so he has to retake the pawn, else just be a pawn down, or move that knight on f6, which was under attack, of course. And now bishop g5. So the threat now is to, well, remember you're always welcome to pause the video at any time and see if you can figure out, of course, what the players are thinking. Indeed, in your investigations of a chess game, this is, something you, by no means, you're not obliged to do, but if you wish to understand better how the pieces interact with one another and the way you know, chess masters think, then definitely, you know, this is a good tip. You know, otherwise just enjoy the show. But so the threat here is, a threat is to take this pawn on e5, and then after queen, Benko recaptures queen takes e5. Of course, we will have uncovered an attack, a double attack against that knight on f6, and afterwards Petrosian could play bishop takes f6, which would fork the rook on h8 and Benko's queen on e5. So that's quite a, you know, has a bit of a nasty sting, this bishop g5. So h6. So the bishop drops back to h4. And so one might be tempted here to play g5, trying to, you know, break the pin. But unfortunately, this doesn't work due to this. This is quite a relatively standard sacrifice in analogous positions. White can often sacrifice a knight here for 2 pawns, and the point is that basically, you know, what does what does black do here? And if, for example, we're rook d6, which looks as though everything's, you know, that black's holding, well, it turns out it actually isn't, because queen f3 brings a third piece up to attack this pinned knight. Seems to be the source of a lot of black's problems in this position. And of course, the knight can't move without losing the queen, and you also can't bring up it's not possible to bring a third piece to the defense. So g5, not to be recommended there. So rook d6 anyway. And now comes knight takes e5 anyway. So, and the point is that after queen takes e5, Petrosian has bishop g3. So skewering the queen and the rook here. So queen to e7, but of course now this means we can push forwards with e5. And the point is that because of this fork, forking this pawn, forking knight on f6 and the rook on d6, Petrosian regains his piece. So we get rook d7 and rook takes f6. And so rook takes f6 rather than capturing with a pawn, although that was possible, because at least this way we maintain a fluid pawn centre. And that rook's just on a really powerful square there, deep in the, you know, deep in black's camp, deep in enemy territory. So h5. I guess maybe, I mean, is that intended to push on to h4? Possibly. I mean, it's actually, I mean, black's position here is already bankrupt. I mean, you know, I mean, he might as well. I mean, if it were me, I think I would just grab that pawn on c4 and, you know, just try and make a fight of it. Anyway, so let's see. So Petrosian just plays h4 himself, and that way, it basically black can't play h4, and Petrosian just manages to, you know, maintain this bishop on this nice diagonal, looking after the e5 pawn. And so rather than grab that pawn on c4, Benko retreats this bishop to b7. And now comes queen a4. Now, earlier, queen a4 would not have been a good place for the queen. But here, this is, you know, the position's different. And basically, Problem is this knight can't move anywhere good. You'd have to risk dropping that pawn on a7. Something, you know, so slowly but surely the queen is infiltrating black's position. So rook g8 here. It's difficult to suggest anything better for Benko here. So it just seems he wants to push this g pawn to g5 and, you know, try and open up some lines on the king side. You know, he has to do something to try and get some activity. So finally, this rook on a1, which has not been doing much at all, comes into the fray, rook af1. And of course, this just increases the pressure on Benko's position. So, and there's a threat here potentially to even give up the two rooks for black's queen. Now, that's not always an easy decision to make, because in many cases, two rooks can prove to be stronger than a queen. Of course, the rooks can always, as long as they're coordinating well together, they can create threats of mates. Of course, they can protect one another, so on and so forth. Here, I think it would be a good exchange, simply because with the removal of that pawn on f7, it would mean that these basically this pawn on e5 would become a pass pawn. There'd be no black pawns to prevent its gradual progression to the promotion square on e8. So I think that's a real threat in the position, and that explains Benko's rook g7 here. Basically just giving extra protection to that f7 pawn. And basically it only requires a couple more moves by Petrosian to force Benko's resignation. So d6, queen is forced onto the back rank. She drops back to d8. And now, this is one of those, problem positions that, you'll often, if you are working with any chess literature, it's a kind of, basically, you'll find positions like this that will say things like, white to play and win, or, white to play, how would you continue? And so it basically just remains here for Petrosian to find the breakthrough, which of course, a player of his caliber, particularly back in the day, bearing in mind this game was played in 1955 when Petrosian was a much younger man than today. Well, what would you play? So the breakthrough here comes in the form of e6. Lovely move. And the problem is that if this pawn is taken, then Benko is losing his queen after rook f8. And of course, the queen can't move without leaving the black king in check. So therefore, that pawn for the moment is immune. But Benko does have rook takes d6. But simply bishop takes d6 here, and it's game over. So presumably, were Benko to have continued trying to fight, I think trying being the operative word here. Well, it's just, it's hopeless, simply because, well, you can just take this pawn on f7, and black really has no good reply here. You've basically, the queen on d6 is under attack, and we're threatening to promote this pawn on f7 to a queen on the next move when it gets to f8. And if, for example, you play a move like queen f8 here to try and prevent that and get the queen out of trouble, that can be met very simply by queen e8 check. And the result is the same, basically. If you move the king, you just lose your queen for nothing. Of course, if you trade queens here, then simply the pawn promotes anyway, bang queen. And as you can see, black's goose is well and truly cooked. Anyway, guys, that was Petrosian versus Power Benko, Budapest 1955. And it was my real pleasure to share this with you today. That is all from me just now. Wish you all the very best, and yeah, look forward to being with you again real soon. Bye.